this is a precious human life we have, to come into the teachings, to have Sangha, to have, enough safety that we can practice. We're not in the middle of a war zone. I mean, all these, we have a body that can actually practice in whichever way is possible for us, but to not take it for granted, that what we have is a precious human life. And then gratitude for the earth that gives us these bodies to be here with. Gratitude, to all the plants and the animals that sustain us. Gratitude to the original people of the lands that we're in, because they knew how to live in balance with the earth, which we've sort of lost touch with and are struggling to find our way back to that. And so gratitude for our individual ancestors of our families, and also the spiritual ancestors that hold us. And so I begin with the refuges. I do 4 refuges, so I'll say them once, and you just follow with me. I'll do them 3 times. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. I take refuge in the Supreme Mother, the perfection of sublime knowing. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. I take refuge in the Supreme Mother, the perfection of sublime knowing. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. I take refuge in the Supreme Mother, the perfection of sublime knowing. So I think I'll get started. And this is not a formal, usual Dharma talk. I'm going to call it Retreat Pearls. I was able to do my long retreat at the beginning of the year, and this one went kind of different than some of the other ones. And so I think I just want to share a little bit from that, and then leave plenty of time for questions so that we can open the teachings up a little bit more. So, it was January, at the beginning of the year that I began. I wanted to do 6 weeks, but I ended up only being able to do 4. And that is such a privilege to be able to set that much time aside to tune in. And I don't take it for granted. So I began, and the first couple of weeks, it was when we had that atmospheric river, there was a lot of rain, and the creeks that were very dry started filling up. And in Marin County, the salmon returned after being gone for quite a while. I couldn't believe, how do they know out in the ocean it rains, and they know that they can tell that the creeks are flowing, and so they started spawning. And I knew this was happening, but it was right at the beginning of the retreat, so I didn't want to leave and go. I had to drive a ways to go see them. So I waited, maybe 2.5 weeks or almost 3. And so I finally, I'm going to go to Lagunitas Creek in West Marin and see them. So I get there, and there aren't a lot of people, but it's a beautiful creek. I mean, it's just flowing, full. Where I come from in Dominican Republic, we would call it a river, but here it's a big country. They call it a creek. So I'm there and walking along the side and looking for the salmon, and they're none to be seen. But I don't give up. I keep walking up the creek, and then finally I realize I'm not going to see them, and it's okay. So I sit down to meditate by the bank of the creek, and I'm sitting there for a while. And after a while, I had hiking poles with me. The hiking poles were lying next to me. And then across the creek, all of a sudden I see something. And it's this big cat coming down. And I think, oh, is this a mountain lion? What is it? But then I look closer and I see the pointed ears. And then I realize, no, this is a lynx, which they also call a bobcat. But it's a really big one. And it looks very old and kind of worn out. And the hind bones and the hips are kind of sticking out. So it looks like it's very hungry and comes down. And all of a sudden, they see me and I see, it's like we both kind of like, oh, and I'm thinking, I got my hiking poles, if worse comes to worse, And then it's sort of like apprehensive. But little by little, it decided, it kind of leaned back on his back legs behind, next to a rock. And I could almost feel the fur slowly like lying down so that it relaxed. And then I relaxed. And so we're right across from each other. And then I could see slowly its eyes would just move over the surface of the creek, looking for salmon. And I could feel like how much this animal really needed some food. But it was just so calm doing that. And then after a while, it didn't even do that. It just sort of settled. And I could almost feel its mind. And realizing the lynx does not have a discursive mind like we do. The lynx doesn't get lost in all this chatter. It's just there doing what's appropriate. And so it just kept sitting there. So little by little, I felt like I was getting a teaching from this animal. Like it was just like a download on a quiet mind. And leading up to that, the first couple of weeks were not easy. I was going through all this insecurity and my own psychology and like things kind of being deconstructed. So I felt like I was kind of falling apart before I went to the creek. And what I realized is I was like everything I thought I knew was just falling away. So then I got to this place of like really, like I don't really know anything. And so it was this place of not knowing. And I just decided I'm just going to stay with this. And it was a way of approaching that ground that I've never quite experienced quite like that. So I stayed with it. And then I realized that when we don't know, that's when actually things can come in. When we think we know, even if there's some little gaps in the knowing where new information can come in, we're seeing through this veil of past experience. And so remembering, the later I was reflecting on this, that so much in Zen is predicated on either Suzuki Roshi used to talk about beginner's mind. In the beginner's mind, everything is possible. But in the expert, very little can happen in the expert's mind. And so in the tradition of Korean Zen, there was a teacher that many people here in the US learned from, Sung Sung. And he used the term, don't know mind. And so this don't know mind, when we were meditating, and I was saying, if you can, turn your attention into that, if you turn the attention towards the mind and you follow it, and then you find this empty cognizance. It's like, it's an emptiness, but that emptiness can know, can perceive, can register what's going on. That is the don't know mind. And I was thinking, with family, we get so patterned in how we interact. And so my grandkids, like sometimes they're telling me something and I'm already like thinking about, trying to teach them something or like do something with what they're saying instead of like just being open and ask questions and let it open more for them, so that in this the not knowing allows us to really be curious and to actually take in what's happening. And it's the hardest with family, because we from both sides, we get conditioned into how we see each other, what we think, we have this whole picture of each other. And it's almost like very little new information can come in. So part of what keeps propping up this feeling of having to know is that the whole culture runs on, how much you know. Do you know about this? Sometimes when I used to live in the East Bay, approaching the Bay Bridge, everybody's like strategizing how they're going to get ahead and how they're going to be in front of the other one. It's like, it's just like all the strategy in the mind and all the stress. And, we're rewarded for being quick. My daughter says, this is the age, like optimization, optimizing everything. And so that requires so much mental activity. Very little freedom in that. We might have a little transient good feeling like, we got ahead of that one, or now we impressed this other person or whatever. But those are really temporary, small little joys that disappear quite quickly because things change. But the rest, the ease that is present in that state of what they would say not knowing is profound. And the thing is that that's where our real capacity to meet not only the ordinary, but the extraordinary things that can show up. That part of our being that doesn't have it figured out before it even happens, but that is actually open to know how it is when it happens, to find out. That is a freedom that we don't have when we think we have it all figured out. So when we talk about freedom, it's not, the convention of freedom often is thought of as having our way, having things the way we want them, being able to come and go and do everything we want to do, like go everywhere we want to go or whatever, but that freedom is all is predicated on the external world rewarding us. And, eventually we all run into walls, and then we're all disappointed and the freedom is gone. So that freedom is very conditional, and it's very intermittent, little bits of freedom here and there. This don't know mind, this resting back. I was thinking back to the lynx. I mean, the lynx is sitting next to this creek. There's no salmon to be had. The animal is hungry. But there's just this steadiness in the mind. And we humans, we can extrapolate, we can abstract, we can conceptualize. And it's a blessing. We've made an amazing world, and also a very difficult world. But most of us live trapped in it. So how do we learn to relax back into that ground? In the midst of all that's happening right now, it's so intense. If I feel it as I get older, I get more stressed out than I used to before. Even though I have all these teachings and I know there's something about the nervous system, being a grandmother and all that. But that I realize I have to keep coming back to the practice and training. And the freedom is in the relaxing into that ground. As I was describing, that ground is what we actually are. So when we are born, we do not have a mind full of concepts. We are in a state of oneness with everything when we are born. And there's an openness. If you watch a baby, they don't have the capacity to decide, I want this, I don't want that. I like this, I look like that. I mean, they don't want to be in pain, and the physical and need to be nourished. But the mind is not busy strategizing. It cannot do it. So as we practice and the development unfolds, we can actually come back to the freedom of that mind that is utterly open. And so the don't know mind is qualities of that are that incredible openness. Within that openness, we can be very appropriate to the circumstances because we are not laying on top of what's going on all this baggage from past experience. So we can actually see the details of what's going on and respond appropriately. And because our mind is in rattle with all the past and the associations, we can be much more courageous or fearless. And we can be more spontaneous and genuine. And so right now it might feel like a tall order, but we have to keep bringing these things on up because they are the deepest part of our practice, is rediscovering the freedom of that mind before we thought we knew everything. It's a mind that is relaxed. It's like the innocence of a child. That's in us still. When we don't become experts. And there's a very gentle humility in that knowing. And that humility makes incredible compassion possible. It's a freedom of compassion also. So there are all these different aspects, and we could talk about it, but I'm not going to talk much more. I'm just going to stop, and I want to hear from you, like how this lands. Like sometimes I forget, I've been practicing too long, and I forget, like what happens when people are beginning, and how far-fetched does this seem, or I mean, many of you experience it. I know. I look at some faces. I know you've been there. You recognize that it's not even a being there; it's in there. We just have to recognize it. And I want to say one more thing about it: that we get glimpses of this all over the place during our days, but we don't recognize it and we don't value it. So the importance of teaching about this is so that when a little glimpse happens, that you go, oh, there, that's it. When your mind is quiet, you're not doing anything, and you can just feel like this ease out of nowhere. That's it. That's your essence, peeking through this, huge scaffolding that we live within. So I'll stop there, and then I'll just see what, we just do a little bell. The don't know mind, as I was saying, is that utterly open ground of our being, that it doesn't have boundaries. It's like an expanse of awareness that is the source of everything. So it's limitless. Whereas when we know, it's bound. So boundless versus bound. It's a very simple way to describe it. The way I got it during this retreat was different from the way I've had it before. This time, more of my notions were deconstructed in a way that actually made me feel discombobulated and unglued, like my ego was falling apart, But maybe, I once in a while I tell the story when I was training in medicine in the emergency room at San Francisco General was the scariest place to have to be in charge. And oh my God, it was like a nightmare. And sometimes I would go, and I was doing my regular meditation, but then sitting meditation, maybe 20 minutes in the morning is all I could do, with this incredible schedule. So then, I had to rotate 3 different years through there. So finally, the third year, I used to go for 12 hours, not be able to go to the bathroom because there was so much coming in, one ambulance after another. So then I decided to wake up earlier and meditate more, which steadied my mind more. I could have access to that. And then it was incredible what happened. An ambulance would call in saying, we're bringing this and this and this, the details of what was going on. And I had 2 cases of things that were so obscure. And I'd only read about it or heard it in a class. And all of a sudden, that came right in. I knew what it was. And when the person arrived, sure enough, and I had to move very quickly or the person would have died. And I was right. But the thing is that the information was available because my mind had gotten way more quiet. And all of a sudden I had time to sit around and tell jokes to the nurses, and they weren't all mad at me because I'm not moving fast enough. And, so I tell that story because high stress functioning, and yet finding some way, even if I slept less, to reconnect to that made me way more effective. And so because we live in a society that values all this discursive knowledge, which has its place, But if all we have is that and we have no access to this other one, we're limited. If we have that, then when we use our regular, ordinary mind, it's way more effective, way more to the point. With political work, people always say, you're going to space out in spirituality and then you're not going to really be involved in this world and changing things. And I would say, if you have access to this, it's like people like Mandela and Martin Luther King, they had access to that. And look at what they did. So that's my, and this is very different from a spiritual bypass that we so often will see. There is a very, very powerful meditation you can do with a mirror. And I did it, quite a few years ago. And the person that was teaching me was first, just working with yourself as object and subject. So I would look at the person in the mirror, myself, and how do I feel about her? And then I would ask, how do you feel about me? And sort of like feeling myself as an object and as the subject. And that was really interesting what came up. But I started working with it regularly. And what happened was that, it's intense, because then eventually all this self-criticism came up, and then I stayed with it. And some of it was so crazy that then I could see like whose voice it was. I had a very tough grandma, and it was like her voice, and I stayed with it, but I realized it's so insane. It's like it just broke, like it broke the hold it had on me. It just like poof, and it changed forever. And so the mirror meditation, sometimes I would sit in front of the mirror and look at the face, and it's like all of humanity is going through that face, like just one person after another, this kind of person, that kind of person. And probably, I don't know if it was past lives I'm seeing or what, but it was just like, so that when I was talking about this is a precious human life, this body, it's like really recognizing this vehicle for experience. The awakened mind has this vehicle for experience. And then, our psychology, we get all scrambled in that because of all the different feelings about the body and all of that. But really, this body is just one of many. Like humanity moves through, a lot of different bodies, even though we don't talk about reincarnation in Vipassana. But in Tibetan Buddhism, which I'm very embedded in, we do. So then, the possibilities of working with a mirror are many, but you need to be ready, because it is you're really confronting yourself. The links stayed there. We stayed for a long time. And it never left. I finally left myself and it was still sitting there. And I can feel it still with me now. This was in January. Now, this is April. I felt like I was given a transmission and that's still here, you know. And then I tried to look up, the meaning, the links, and to tell you the truth right now, all I remember is like holder of secrets or something like that. But there's a lot more to it. At least in the Native American sacred traditions here of this country. I don't know if their links are in different parts of the world, but here. So no, I'm telling you the story because it felt like a real teaching from the natural world. From we the whole thing in Dzogchen, deep Dzogchen, is believed that the whole thing is participating in the process of enlightenment. Human beings with this mind, can understand it to a certain point, but that the whole of the manifested world is coming from awakened mind into form. And so the whole thing is evolving to the point where it recognizes itself, it recognizes what it is.